Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining what we know will be one of many conversations about a change that has occurred in higher education that has had an impact on the work that we do to diversify our institutions. This event today, Changing Landscapes, Implications of the SCOTUS Affirmative Action Decision on Higher Education, is being brought to you by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here at Hopkins. We have a great team of folks behind us who've worked very diligently to bring to you a panel of experts to talk about initial implications. As you know, there was a great deal of information that was given in the briefings from the SCOTUS decision, but most universities, including our own, are taking the time to do the work to make sure that we understand the decision and we understand the implications for our actions. I know many of you want quick responses. You want to know because you care and are committed to this space on what will Hopkins do to move forward our efforts in this space. Unfortunately, today we will not be able to address those questions, but we have gathered those questions so that as we make decisions, we will make sure to communicate those decisions to our community. So I'm going to get out of the way so the panel can give you their expert opinion and their initial impressions of the decision and its impact. By introducing Tiffany Wright, our moderator for today, I'm so excited that she has joined the Hopkins community. She's part of the Office of the Vice Provost and General Counsel as Deputy General Counsel beginning in May 2023. So we're already putting her to good work. And it's great that she's a partner during this time for us. Prior to joining Johns Hopkins, Ms. Wright served as Associate Counsel to the President in the Office of the White House Counsel. In that position, she provided strategic and legal advice to the President, Vice President, and senior White House advisors on a wide array of legal issues, including Title IX, gender and LGBTQ plus equity, reproductive rights, clemency, and religious liberty. So, with that, I'll introduce you to our moderator today, Ms. Tiffany White.
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell, and welcome everyone to our discussion. I'm going to start with a little bit of table setting and a very brief overview of the Supreme Court's decision, and then I will introduce our wonderful panelists before we dive in. As many of you know, there are really two laws that are involved in this space. First, we have the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution that applies to state and federal government actors like public universities like UNC or the University of Maryland. Second, we have Title VI, which applies to all who receive federal funding, including private universities like Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. Both of these laws forbid discrimination on the basis of race. In a line of cases that began in 1978, including the 2003 decision in Grutter versus Bollinger, the Supreme Court held that under both the Equal Protection Clause and Title VI, universities could consider race as one among many factors as part of a holistic review process. On June 29th, the reason we're all here today, the court decided two cases, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and versus UNC, that severely limited any consideration of race in admissions. The court did not say that it was overruling Grutter and its prior precedent, but the decision leaves very little of it in place. To help us consider what this means for university admissions and beyond, I am joined by an esteemed panel of experts in this space. I'm going to introduce them and give them a chance to give you an overview of their work in this area. First, we have Dr. Crystal Newby, who is the Senior Director of Strategic Admission, Access, and Diversity Initiatives at the College Board. Dr. Newby?
Thank you so much. As Ms. Wright said, yes, I serve at College Board as a part of the strategic higher ed team. And in my role, I primarily work with our Access and Diversity Collaborative, which we call the ADC. And the ADC was established in 2004 in light of the Grutter decision from 2003 that Ms. Wright just mentioned. And the ADC is a member-led coalition of institutions as well as organizations who are committed to access and diversity and equity within higher education. And so we work with our colleagues in the ADC to inform our higher ed members exactly about what we are going to dig in today around consideration of race and admissions. And in addition, prior to my work at College Board, I did work at the National Association for College Admission Counseling. I was their director of diversity, equity, inclusion, but also served an extensive time in education and training. So creating, developing, implementing professional learning experiences for not only higher ed colleagues, but also our K-12 colleagues. And my background primarily is college admissions, and I am thrilled to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Newby. We'll now introduce Dr. Zachary Bleemer, who is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton University.
Hi, folks. Really good to be with you all. So I should emphasize that my background is as an economist, not a lawyer, but I've spent the last couple of years thinking about and publishing about the ramifications of banning affirmative action in the states that have previously implemented such bans, at least with regard to public universities. So I'll be talking today primarily about the state of California, which implemented a public university affirmative action ban starting in 1998. This led to a cascade of Black and Hispanic students into less selective universities, with the most selective schools, Berkeley and UCLA, losing about 40% of their Black and Hispanic students year over year immediately when the affirmative action ban was implemented. This led to declines in degree attainment at the undergraduate and graduate level, and in particular in lucrative STEM degrees. And because this ban was implemented so many years ago, we can then follow all of those Black and Hispanic young people into the labor market, and we see that wages throughout their 20s, 30s, and likely further declined by about 5% on average for the high testing Black and Hispanic students who were sending applications into the University of California system in the 1990s. So we have this very persistent decline in wages. I think there's reason to expect similar changes in the coming years, especially in states that were still implementing affirmative action programs in their public universities and at highly selective private schools. Sort of interestingly, a lot of my work is focused on the relative ramifications of banning affirmative action for the Black and Hispanic students who lose access to selective universities and the white and Asian students who take their places. And it looks like there's a growing amount of evidence that the wage losses for these targeted Black and Hispanic students pretty substantially exceed the gains received by their white and Asian peers. There's a net decline in the average efficiency of American higher education when relatively disadvantaged students lose access to selective schools, something I'll probably talk more about coming forward.
Thank you, Dr. Bleemer. We will now be joined by Dr. Annette Anderson, who is an assistant professor in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University.
Good morning. I joined wearing a lot of different hats. I am a Baltimore City native and resident. I am the mother of 3 who have gone through Baltimore City public schools. And so I wear the hat of a mother who has been watching her own personal kids get to the gates, as I call it, these gates of attainment, trying to get to these top universities, public and private in this country. Also, as an assistant professor, one of my roles is as faculty lead for the School Administration and Supervision program. So we are training our aspiring leaders both in the independent school space as well as the public school space. So we're looking at the candidates who are coming into those spaces to supervise our students in schools to get them ready for this next level of higher education and college and career readiness. I also serve as the deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools. And so we also consider the realm of diversity as we look at what healthy and safe schools actually look like at post-pandemic. And I also think that we have a lot of conversation to have about how this decision is going to affect student attainment. So I'm looking forward to having the conversation with our colleagues on many of these topics. I've served as a principal. I've served in many school-based roles, from classroom teacher to curriculum coordinator. I was the founder of the first university assisted charter school in Pennsylvania. So I think that, my piece of this is looking at this K-12 attainment piece and what it's going to mean for impact in our public school and independent school spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. And finally, we'll be joined by Dr. Anthony Carnevale, who is the director of the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University.
First, let me say that in our own work at Georgetown, we're Bleemerites. We agree with Bleemer. And that is, we found in our work that you cannot easily get race by using class. The court seemed to leave an opening for class-based affirmative action that I think a lot of people are depending on, but our data runs show that it is true you can claw back a little bit of the racial diversity that you had, but not much, especially compared to the growing share of minorities in the high school class, which is kind of an obvious standard or goal to be used in the American case. We're very far from that, and we're going to get further away as the minority share in high school grows. The second thing I wanted to say is that in the decision itself, in various places, those opposed to affirmative action left some landmines for class, and that is Roberts and a couple other people essentially said that, and I'm paraphrasing Roberts in this case, what is prohibited directly, that is race-conscious affirmative action, is also prohibited if done indirectly. So any attempt to use alternative means to get race will be subject to suit. I think we see, all of us involved in this see this coming in the court cases focused on gifted and talented programs in high schools in Virginia, New York, California, and elsewhere. So this is not over, and the use of class is a very weak point of leverage to make up for the racial diversity lost. The other thing that is not talked about much, but I know from talking with college presidents and being involved with them and trying to get more class, that is low-income kids, into elite institutions in a project funded by Bloomberg. And what I learned from them is that the problem with low-income people is they don't have enough money, which is to say doing class is very expensive. Too expensive, truthfully. That is, it costs a lot of money. And that in and of itself, for a large share of what we think of as selective colleges, if you're talking about the top 200 colleges in selectivity in America, they simply can't afford this. The last thing I'll say is that there is already reaction, kind of resentment politics on this has already set in. Higher education selective colleges are already elitist. In the sense that they include lots of high-income people, lots of white people who need diversity so they can be the bosses in diverse institutions and run a diverse society, basically. So in the end, what's happening already on the Hill in the Congress is that elitism is admittedly a bad look in American politics. The populist left and the populist right, and they're going to go after the elite colleges with things like, there is a bill that has been written to disallow legacies and donors. I don't think that will fly, but I think what we'll get at least is a demand that by the Congress that legacies and donors be reported to the Department of Education.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, we will dive into our discussion of the opinions and their impact. And we'll start with, generally, do you think this decision has set us back, and how so?
I'm happy to start to get the conversation started. You know, I think so much work has gone into this over the past 45 years, right? Starting with Bakke, 1978, and all of the other court cases leading up to this. And this just means there's still going to be more challenges. Even before this ruling was made last week, there were still challenges, right? Working through building diverse classes and things like that. And so I think this decision just continues to make it a little bit harder. Saying it's a setback, I don't know if I want to call it a setback. I'm still trying to be optimistic in this whole thing, but it just certainly presents more challenges. And I think what institutions have to do is really think about, okay, so what can we do moving forward? As opposed to what can't we do? Because we have no choice but to move forward, right? Like, just because the Supreme Court made this decision doesn't mean we just stop the work. This means that we have to roll up our sleeves even more and keep digging and keep doing the work.
I would just jump in to say that I think that this decision has had tremendous downstream effects for the Black middle class and for the Latino middle class. As Dr. Carnevale said, I think that what you're going to see is an ever tightening, fewer number of students who are going to be admitted to the top 100. He said 200 most selective institutions. But I think for those open access colleges, of which there are a couple thousand actually, I think we're not going to see as much of a shift there in terms of the numbers of students who apply to those schools. I think that what we really have to understand, as also Dr. Carnevale alluded to earlier, is that the finances behind attending these prestigious institutions are often a barrier. Even though there are need-blind admissions policies that are meant to try to stopgap that, we all know that those financial situations are often barriers for students to be able to get into this gate. I like to call these barriers gates. And so what we're going to see is that this really impacts the African-American middle class, who, by virtue of, the Civil Rights Act, have really been able to buy into more diverse neighborhoods, access independent schools. They've been able to purchase proximity. And what this decision does, to me, it affects the Black middle class and the Latino middle class more than it affects the lower classes, because those are the students that now have the access for the test prep, for the extended activities, for all of the things that make them a well-rounded candidate as they're applying to colleges. And so I think that it's going to have a tremendous effect there. I think there's been a lot of conversation lately in the African-American community about how we reinforce and support our HBCUs so that they become a stronger net for our students who are coming from middle-class families. But the question is whether the infrastructure there actually can support as much of that. And so as we think about how we're getting our students, our young people in K-12 to these gates, I think we just have to be more intentional about how we're building out the spaces in which they grow and thrive, and also about when and how strongly we intervene when our students are not getting to the gates on time. So there's several gates that I like to talk about: kindergarten and executive function, third grade in reading, eighth grade in algebra, high school choice, and then high school graduation. So if we know that fewer of the students that we most want to see represented in these top 100 most selective institutions are going to have more trouble now getting to these gates, it, I think, becomes incumbent on us to have more strategies for intervention earlier and more strategically. Thank you.
I would add in that a lot of this depends on who you're asking as to whether this is a good or bad thing. Keep in mind that most Americans are opposed to race-conscious affirmative action, including Hispanics and African Americans. And secondly, Whether it's a good or bad thing depends on how far left you are in one case. And that is, if you go far enough left, people have been saying for decades that we've been using race-conscious affirmative action to buy off African-American elites, and that we need to, so this has just been a Band-Aid. We really haven't done much about race in America, and we need to rip off the Band-Aid. So there are lots of people who think this is a good thing, people with very different politics. I think at the end, it's not a good thing. I think that ultimately this has all the effects that we would suppose, and I think we'll see much more of it. This is just the beginning.
I can help, I think, at least put some of these ideas into context. So what we saw in California and in other states that have previously implemented affirmative action bans, particularly Texas and Michigan, which had highly selective public universities that immediately stopped using affirmative action, is this large decline in Black and Hispanic enrollment at those states' flagship institutions, but roughly no change in aggregate Black or Hispanic college enrollment. These kids are all still going to college, they're just going to college at less selective schools. And so there's sort of an important question here of exactly how valuable are these more selective schools to the students targeted by race-based affirmative action. As I mentioned, these schools have actually outsized value for these targeted students, and the value of flagship institutions is relatively large. But there are a lot of ways to get ahead in America, and these flagship institutions only provide one of those ways. So in California, because the ban was implemented so long ago in that state, we can ask the following question. Look in 2014, roughly 15 years after the ban was, California's affirmative action ban was implemented, and just ask, first, how many people are there who've hit the following qualifications? They are 31 to 35 years old. They're Black or Hispanic, and they earn at least $100,000 a year in the labor market in terms of wages. And so it turns out in California in those years, there were roughly 22,000 of these high-earning young Black and Hispanic professionals. And you can then ask, okay, but 2014 was a year in which those 31 to 35-year-olds wouldn't have had access to affirmative action when they themselves applied to college 15 or 20 years earlier. How many more of them would there have been if they had had affirmative action in those years, and they've been able to go to more selective universities and would have gotten like the extra bump in the labor market that comes in your early 30s when you've come out of a flagship institution? And the answer is something like 700 or 800 more on average. So call it like 3% more of these high-earning young Black and Hispanic professionals. Now, I don't know, it's sort of unclear to me whether that number is big or small. This was a very explicit single governmental policy change that roughly disappeared 3% of the high-earning Black and Hispanic professional class. These were people, people ended up earning less money, falling below this threshold because they didn't have access to more selective schools. But the large majority of Black and Hispanic high-earning professionals in the state remained because they found other ways of succeeding outside of just going to the state's most successful university. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that while something very substantial has happened that meaningfully changes the kinds of outcomes that these students can receive, it's not, the sky hasn't fallen. There are still a lot of ways to succeed in America.
Thank you. And we have a related question on this issue of using or looking at class. What are the possibilities? One of the things that's been suggested is using zip codes to help capture some diversity in admissions. And so I would be very grateful to hear your thoughts on that.
I can quickly start in the California context. So when affirmative action was banned in the state, Berkeley and UCLA very substantially overhauled their admissions practices. In addition to starting to provide explicit admissions advantages on the basis of local neighborhood and high school, in particular, high schools with large minority populations. They also ended the use of legacy admissions, which had been used in public universities in California until '99. They ended the use of donor preferences, so you could no longer provide large gifts and get into the university. And they implemented many of the other holistic review practices that have become, I think, very popular talking points over the last couple of months as potential replacements for race-based affirmative action. When I said earlier that Black and Hispanic enrollment at Berkeley and UCLA fell by about 40% after the affirmative action ban was implemented, that's net all of these changes. So despite the very substantial change in the sort of class-based or local geography-based preferences provided to applicants. Nevertheless, we saw very large enrollment declines at Berkeley and UCLA.
The other point I would make is whatever you do to try to get race, don't get caught. That is, if you're using geography and somebody looks at your numbers and says, there's a disparate impact here, you're getting an awful lot of Black people and Latinos and Indigenous people, and they sue you. I mean, the folks on the other side of this fight are smart, well organized, dedicated, and well funded. And they know that this is the first step. I know a bunch of them. They know that this is the first step in a whole series of court cases. So whatever you do to use class to get race, if anybody can show that you're getting a disparate impact on race, that is, how come you don't have more white people when you're using poverty? You'll be sued.
And
I guess my question is whether or not that's something that's worthwhile, though, right? I think, so Dr. Carnevale, it's your center, and I'm a McCourt grad. So I come to this information partly because of my studies, but I know that, for example, a graduate of Georgetown, a graduate of Harvard, they are likely to make over their 40 years of investment. Their ROI is estimated to be 3 times what it would be at an open access institution. And so it does matter whether or not we are able to have students of color considered, because it affects their capacity as over their lifetime earnings. So I do think that the question that society is going to have to grapple with is, does it matter that we have parity of access? Because students of color will have less opportunity to achieve those ROIs if they are continued to be steered into these less selective institutions. And are they harmed if they don't have access?
I want to jump in just for a moment. I'm sorry, Dr. Carnevale, you answer first.
I think that the heroes in this story will be the employers. I think in the end, if we all know how this works, that is, the big fancy companies go to Harvard and have career day so that when they send out their consultants, they can say, I'm sending you 4 Yales and 6 Harvards, and that's how they make the sale. So and it is a very bad look in America not to have diversity in your workforce. Is Bill Clinton's old standard. You got to look like America. We all believe that. And there are consequences if you don't have a diverse workforce. Al Sharpton may show up. There is, he took Jesse Jackson's job. So it is I think employers will come through here. They actually have to in the end. I think they may have their career fair at Harvard, but they'll do one at UMass down the road to get the diversity they need.
And I just wanted to hop in quick to go back to where this question started around the use of zip codes, because having an admissions background, having worked with lots of colleagues in admissions, this is nothing new for admissions offices. Admissions offices have been utilizing geography for years to be able to decide where they do outreach to students, where they're recruiting students. And so this isn't something that is new. This is something that will continue to evolve. I know prior to the decision that the court made, we had conversations with our members at College Board, our higher ed members in admissions, who were already talking about ways where they can look at other geographical locations where maybe they hadn't looked before when they're thinking about outreach to students. And so that's something, again, that's not new. I just wanted to make sure that our attendees today understood that this is something that admissions offices are still going to continue to take a look at as they are putting together their outreach and recruitment strategies.
Thank you. And zooming out or zooming ahead, are there long-term implications? Where do you think we'll be as a result of this decision in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? Where does this take us?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly to say that I do think that it will impact the generational wealth. So we just talked for a moment about the ROI at these top 100 institutions. as opposed to the less selective institutions. And so the building of generational wealth is something that I think is going to have to be a consideration. We know, for example, that home ownership in African American and Latino communities has never exceeded 50%. And so being able to have more students access these levers of change, education is the great equalizer. And so having more students be able to access these levers of change will be critical. But I also think that we have got to take a look at what the policies are that, again, that are supporting in K-12 those students, whether we're talking about gifted programs, magnet schools, tracking, all of those things are the levers that help students get recognized beyond color, beyond class, but it's primarily parents who have knowledge of those institutional systems that get their kids in those queues to those gates. And so without having more steerage to those gates, I think that we do see more downstream impacts that affects the generational wealth, as well as the capacity for more students to actually get to and graduate from these institutions of higher education. And let me just add this. The other concern that I have is that we have to look at increasing the number of not only Pell applicants, because we know that these top 100 schools really focus on having, as I said, need blind admissions, but they also have very low percentages of students who have Pell access as compared to some of these less selective institutions. And so I think we need to be thinking about how we buttress the financial supports so that students of color, if they are selected, actually have a realistic shot of not only starting at these institutions, but being retained and graduating, finishing. So it's getting through all the gates and the gate of completion, which is the 4-year degree.
Yeah, so I think a lot depends on how public and private universities react to this decision, especially in the public university sector, the sector that enrolls 3/4 of American undergraduates and where I expect the most substantial effects of this decision to fall. Schools like UNC and UVA, Georgia Tech, Ohio State, Penn State, SUNY Binghamton, et cetera, large public institutions with large-scale affirmative action programs. I think there are really two potential ways for these schools and states to react. One way is to change admissions policies to try to pull more kids into these flagship institutions, using policies like top percent policies in which a certain number of students from each high school in a state are guaranteed admission, or the growing number of universities that we've seen switching to either test optional or test blind policies, which may have some small net increasing effect on both lower income and Black and Hispanic enrollment, though my sense is the jury's still sort of out on that. But there are also alternative policies that states can implement instead of trying to figure out how to pull more kids into these selective schools. Another way that states could react is to push money toward the schools where Black and Hispanic students end up enrolling. In other words, pulling money out of flagship institutions and provide a pretty substantially greater funding to less selective schools, community colleges, et cetera. And I think there's been some movement in some states in that direction. I think when we're talking about 30 and 40-year horizons, really a lot just depends on how each state chooses to react to this decision.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was just raised here that is clear but formidable over the longer term is this issue has now shifted to K-12. Higher ed is out of the business, except to the extent that we can do things like fund HBCUs. HBCUs have bipartisan support. Both parties will vote for money for HBCUs. People are happy to vote for separate but equal, which is what HBCUs are when they get money from the feds. Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So I think that's a pathway that will work. I think this is good news for HBCUs. The other is that I don't think when we run the numbers 30 years out, there is this hope among people that demography will save us, that at some point the population will be so full of minorities that we'll have to educate and give them access to elites in America. But when we run those numbers, it takes more than 40 years to get there.
So I just would reply to Dr. Carnevale that I agree that I think we have to have a more systemic investment in HBCUs as a response to this. And I think that part of that is, again, the retention strategies, because many of our HBCUs have 4-year graduation rates that do not exceed 50%. And so we also need to be building in platforms for those students, particularly as those students are first generation, more likely to be a Pell Grant recipient, for those students to be successful, because we've got to get them to the gate of completion. So I think if we're thinking about how to help those HBCUs to increase their infrastructure, for example, capital, buildings, facilities, all of that kind of investment has to be a part of a package that helps those HBCUs to continue to expand. So it's been a great initiative to be able to pour so much money into our HBCUs, but I think we've got to have a more holistic strategy around recruitment and retention that starts earlier in the K-12 space. So I think that's great. I also do thank you for saying that K-12 is where this whole conversation has shifted to, because I think that a lot of, again, going to the Black middle class, I think a lot of the Black middle class thinks that accessing independent schools writ large is the way that they're going to be able to get to these selective institutions. And I think that these 2 court decisions has just proved that moot. So there needs to be more systemic interventions in the K-12 public institution.
And I think it's important to remember that the K-12 courts are open for business. That is, the Supreme Court isn't. In 1973, the Supreme Court declared for all time that there is no right to education in America, and Rodriguez v. San Antonio. So, but there are 31 states that have in their state constitutions a guarantee, and they use different words, but what they're saying is that every kid ought to get an adequate education. And what they mean by that, when they write it down, and increasingly they do, what they mean is that they could survive in a modern economy, also show up for jury duty and be competent to be a jury member. But in the end, and we've now gravitated to a standard in K-12 that every K-12 educator will tell you about, and that is their mission now is to make everybody college and career ready. They make a lot of kids college ready. They don't make anybody career ready. But so I think there's room to move on K-12, and the courts, those courts are open. The federal court, the Supreme Court is, they're now a waste of time on K-12 and have been for a long time.
And so thinking about that, and Dr. Bleemer, one of your responses sort of highlighted this question. Are there different ways in which this ruling might impact public as opposed to private institutions? And if so, how?
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think there are at least 2 primary differences. So one difference is that 9 states already don't use race in undergraduate admissions in their public institutions. And it wouldn't be surprising to see increases in Black and Hispanic enrollment at those schools now that students don't have counterfactual options where affirmative action was available. But that being said, I think the primary difference is going to be in how admissions departments are capable of implementing this policy change. UCLA receives 140,000 applications a year. Even if they were using race at admissions, they wouldn't be able to conduct the kind of holistic review that's very common at private institutions, both just because of volume and because of access to funding in the admissions office. And so I think there's reason to expect more substantial changes in enrollment at selective public than at selective private universities, though it's worth emphasizing that no private university in the US has ever been prohibited from the use of race in admissions. And so I think we have a very bad sense of exactly what that prohibition would look like.
Does anyone else want to tackle that question? No. Okay. Is this, or should we view this as an opportunity for college and university admissions departments to shift focus to other types of diversity, such as viewpoint diversity. We've already talked about socioeconomic diversity, but is there a world in which this is an opportunity to enhance other forms of diversity?
Frankly, I don't think so. That is, I think none of those things are an issue that carries the weight of race in American history. I don't really care if the professors are all liberal. So that, in the end, I think colleges and universities will do that, but I think it's going to be more a communication strategy than anything else.
I would just follow up to say I agree again with Dr. Carnevale. I think that we have posited that good education in the United States is a scarcity. And until we change that economic reality, that there is a level playing field of what good education looks like, I think we'll continue to have these, they are mirages of what diversity will look like if we're trying to look at diversity viewpoints as a way to assess real true diversity. So I think it's a shift. We have to have a shift in the mindset. There cannot be this continued belief that only a few people get to have a great education. Education cannot be a scarcity.
And the next question we have is how this impacts the future of pipeline or pathway programs that were developed specifically to increase diversity.
This is something we've actually spoken a lot about with our higher ed colleagues at College Board as a part of our Access and Diversity Collaborative, because that question has come about quite often. It's like, okay, outside of admission, do we need to change, our fly-in programs that we may have had designated specifically for students of color? Like, what does that look like? And in these conversations, that we've had with our members, it's a matter of they have to take a look at all of those programs. They really do. When the court announced in January 2022 that it was going to review both of these cases, we really started having these conversations, with our colleagues. And they've been talking about essentially doing inventory of these types of programs that they have on their campuses or that come through the admissions office, just to be prepared for this decision that just came down. And so, through these conversations, a lot of our colleagues are taking a look at their programs that they have on their campuses. I know in particular, some of our colleagues at a private institution in Texas, this is something they've done actually for a long time. They had to take a look at their particular programs and decide, when they were marketing them or doing outreach, that they had to expand and open them for students across the board, despite the fact that they were traditionally for students from underrepresented groups. And so I think we're going to see the same now across the board for our colleagues at institutions. They really have to take a look at the programs that they have and really evaluate them.
I think the next big thing that is already here, but hasn't arrived yet on campuses in higher education, is transparency for bachelor, for any kind of degree. That is, you've got to tell a student what happened to all the other kids who took their program, not in their school so much. Schools matter less, colleges matter less and less, and the program you take matters more and more in the data. So the next big thing that's going to happen to higher ed is with the data, at some point, somebody will either pass a counseling bill, because we don't have any in the United States, career counseling in high school or college that's worth a damn. And I think that's the next big change in higher education. I think now to some extent that will work because it will give students a much better sense of what their economic prospects are if they take a degree and in a training program. The current standard in proposed regulations is that any training program, and training Pell is on the way as well, that any training program is going to have to give you the average high school wage, or it can't be subsidized by training Pell or any other federal dollars. So that's the next big thing. And to some extent, To the extent that upward mobility in America is about money, and I think principally it is, that is going to be a challenge for all institutions in higher education. The disturbing part of that, or somewhat disturbing part of that, because I think the training piece is a good idea, is we know when we start building out the training, who's going to get the training and who's going to get the degrees. That is, the training is going to be a boon for high school educated males of all races, but especially Latino and African American. So we're about to segregate higher education a bit more because of the shift to training. So there's an issue there. My own bias is the real answer to this is the one that politicians have already come up with. And that is we're going to have systemic reform in American education. The Democratic Party's plan is basically the one that Biden talks about, which is we're going to have preschool. We're going to triple funding, what we used to be called Title I funding, ESSA funding now, whatever you want to call it, for low income schools and schools. I don't know what's going to happen to schools with high proportions of minorities. And then you're going to have free community college, because we figured out as a nation, and educators know, that first of all, we threw voc ed out of K-12. We got CTE, which is good stuff. But everybody knows you can't make people college and career ready with 4 years of high school. There's no room in that curriculum. So if you add 2 years of community colleges, you've effectively got 6 years, and the community college becomes another pathway to the BA in transfer, or more optimistically, in the 27 states where we've already decided that community colleges can give bachelor's degrees.
So what advice would you all have for university leaderships and students who may be in the pipeline wondering how this affects them?
I think that this underscores the need for mentorship. I think we absolutely need to invest more in higher ed for our current professorate to have opportunities to mentor students, because I like to say you can't become what you don't see. I think that we struggle right now, to go back to Dr. Carnevale's point about K-12. We know that right now that only 2% of our public school teachers are African American male. So we are really struggling already to try to recruit teachers of color and African American teachers of color, in particular, into our classrooms. And so the concern that I have is, when our young people in these schools across the country, public, private, parochial, when they don't see representation of themselves at the front of these classrooms, what message does it send about their value and about their real capacity to be supported and to get to those gates? And so I think that we have to start with mentoring those who are in the current pipeline. I do take my hat off to institutions like Hopkins that as soon as that decision came out, they were out with a message about their investment in DEI and saying that they were not going to relent. I think that being able to say that on a day like the 29th was critically important to audiences that wanted to hear what those institutions were going to do. And I think that those kinds of messages need to continue to be felt and had across university leadership, so that people that work in those spaces, people that look like me at Johns Hopkins, can know that these are institutions that will continue to support this important work.
The one thing I think of is, in one meeting about this with lawyers and college presidents, one of the lawyers said something I'd never thought of, but he said the next decision you've got to make about what you're going to do, you the president, and how you're going to handle this is, do you want to be sued? Now, I would argue that there are a lot of colleges that should want to be sued. That is, Georgetown and Harvard were built in part by slave labor. So my question to the lawyer was, well, what will happen if you get sued? You'll lose the case probably, but what will it cost you mean, that is what's the downside to being sued? Because in the end, you're going to be letting in students who, in the end, the courts are going to say you shouldn't have. You got to think about that too. That's a pretty awful thing to do to somebody, personally, I think.
As I'm thinking about advice for students and administrators, on the student side, one thing that really stands out from states that have implemented bans in the past is that you see immediate declines in application rates, especially to state flagship schools. So about a third of the decline in Black and Hispanic enrollment at Berkeley and UCLA was because kids who could have still gotten into Berkeley and UCLA chose not to apply to those campuses. And to the degree that those application declines just arose because people thought they would no longer be able to get into those schools, this means that something wrong happened. People believed something about the world that was untrue. And so I think it's really worth encouraging students to continue, basically to maintain high aspirations, to believe that they at least could get into some selective institutions that would mitigate the enrollment impact of these affirmative action bans. On the institution side, in talking to university administrators, it seems to me what's most relevant is really thinking through the relationship between universities' admissions policies and their state admissions. I think in the case of many universities, a very strong interest in promoting academic preparation at the very highest level in their student bodies has led them to a variety of admissions policy that, if you were just to implement that policy alone without race or class-based preferences, would lead you to a very homogeneous and undiverse class. But there's no a priori reason that these kinds of extreme academic preparation measures are the best way for a selective private or public university to choose who gets the privilege of access to those schools. And I suspect that this decision will, at least at some schools, lead to a substantial rethinking of how their admissions policies function.
One thing I would add to that, and because for me it's sort of a personal opinion, and that is that kids by race and by class and with other characteristics who aren't like the rest of the, make a stereotype out of this, who aren't like the rest of the rich white kids who go to whatever school or institution it is. It can be a ball club or anyway, a tennis court. The feeling of alienation and not belonging is a very destructive thing, more destructive, I think, than people realize. And I think in the end, part of what goes on with this phenomenon where kids who are qualified and minority don't go is that they don't feel like they belong there. This case is going to make that intensify that feeling across the board for minority students. And the other thing about this, what the case does that really strikes me personally is that what they're saying is, if you, in your essay, if you can tell me a sufficiently devastating story about how awful your life is being a minority in America, by which you probably end up defaming your family, your community, your race, if you can humble yourself before me, basically give me some good race and class porn, I'll let you in. I don't know if nobody here old enough to remember a show called Queen for a Day, back when they used to do this with women on TV, competing to see who had the worst life. But anyway, I find that, and the other piece of it that I find personally offensive is they excluded the military schools. So it apparently minorities in America are good enough to go to school to learn to kill or be killed, but they're not good enough for Harvard. So, there is a depth of cruelty in all this that, we see a lot of, always have, arguably more of it these days. But that, to me, in the end, at a personal level, says some very bad things about those Supreme Court justices that voted for it.
Thank you. We are down to our last 5 minutes, and so we will close with a question from the audience, which is how might this decision impact scholarships and financial aid plans for students? Or diversity fellowships, anything along those lines?
I think I can hop in on this one real quick. While there's a little bit of silence here in the background. The court didn't specifically mention scholarships and financial aid. But what we do know is that because those areas are so closely aligned to the admissions process, institutions are going to need to take a look at what that looks like at their institutions, doing an inventory, just to stay on their toes. Because I want to say, maybe Dr. Carnevale said it earlier, this isn't the end. Just because this ruling came down for SFFA with Harvard and UNC, this isn't the end of these types of cases. And so institutions are going to have to remain vigilant and ensure that they've taken inventory of all of these pieces of the admissions process, including looking at financial aid and scholarships.
Thank you. So did anyone else want to weigh in on that before I close out? Okay. Well, thank you to everyone who's attended this today. This has certainly been an enlightening and meaningful discussion. I'm sure it's the first of many that we will have on how to move forward in this new landscape. But thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to the audience, particularly the members of the audience who submitted questions. And just thank you for a meaningful conversation this afternoon. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.
Have a good afternoon.